For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of the culture for readers and writers to discover and rediscover. We're grateful to our partners this evening, Tablet Magazine, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, and the University of Houston. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. Our jumping off point tonight is the American Canon, Literary Genius from Emerson to Pynchon, a collection of literary critic Harold Bloom's writing on American writers. Published just before his death this past October at the age of 89, the book weaves 5 decades of work, much of it long unavailable or hard to find, into a powerful portrait of American literary inspiration. All Bloom's abiding touchstones are here, from Emerson, Whitman, and Dickinson to Stevens and Bishop, along with Baldwin, Hemingway, Hurston, O'Connor, Ellison, Le Guin, Morrison, Ashbery, and many others. The American Canon was edited with skill and great sensitivity by David Mikics, Moore's Distinguished Professor of English at University of Houston, who joins us tonight. I think Harold Bloom would have enjoyed the fact that we're here tonight on Bloom's Day. He strongly identified with his Joycean namesake, Leopold Bloom, whom he affectionately called Poldy. Anyway, Library of America had the privilege of working with the American Bloom on Emerson's collected poems, volume number 70 in the Library of America series, an anthology of American religious verse, and a selected Walt Whitman. We came at American literary tradition from different angles. Bloom saw a dramatic, imaginative struggle across time between titanic literary figures. Library of America's vision is a series of essential American writing, essential and also surprising, that honors the democratic inclusiveness of our literary and culture. So we didn't always agree. Harold would phone every few months to ask after the little bears, my children, and to request copies of our newest books with a qualification. Max, dear, he'd say, just send me the literary volumes, dear. But for the writers he cared passionately about, all central figures in our tradition, Bloom was the deepest and most intuitive reader of our time. Writers past and present, poets especially, were vital presences in his life, and his response to them was deeply personal. His passions were contagious too, which made him a gifted teacher in person and in print. In a career spanning more than 50 years and 40 books, he inspired reverence for literature in generations of students and readers. He asked us to read literary texts as if they were sacred works, wisdom literature, works of revelation, to engage with literature's ability to shape our posture in the world, our understanding of who we are and who we might become. To talk about Harold Bloom and American writing, we're very fortunate tonight to have with us the editor of this collection, David Mikics. David is editor of the annotated Emerson and author, most recently, of Bellows People, Slow Reading in a Hurried Age, and a forthcoming biography of director Stanley Kubrick. His reviews and articles have appeared in the New Republic and the New York Times, and he is a regular columnist at Tablet Magazine. Joining him in conversation is Library of America editorial director, John Kulka. David and John will talk for about 40 minutes, then invite your questions. You can submit a question or comment anytime by using the Q&A button on your menu bar. If you wish, let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome David Mikics. John, over to you.
David, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Good, excellent, excellent.
Thanks, Max, for that wonderful introduction. We were all privileged to know Harold, all three of us, and I think he would have loved that. But let's get going. Thanks, John.
Great. David, I want to start with some of the things that Max mentioned in his excellent introduction. You know, looking again at this table of contents to the American Canon, it really is such a broad range of writers. The Central American Romantic figures you would expect to see in a book by Harold Bloom, right? In the 19th century, Emerson, Whitman, Melville, Dickinson, and in the 20th century, Faulkner, Stevens, and Bishop, among others. But there are also these many other figures you perhaps would not expect to see in a book by Harold Bloom, even perhaps for readers who know some of the more famous works. I'm thinking particularly of James Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston and Ursula K. Guin. And it occurs to me that these very different writers with different concerns and who occupy very different aesthetic spaces, it occurs to me that what they obviously have in common is Harold Bloom. These are all writers about whom Bloom feels passionately about. And he writes about them, and he writes about their books as if he knew them personally. And this is something that Max had touched upon in his introduction. And I wonder, David, you know, is that an aspect of Bloom's writing that appeals to you most? This kind of deep personal engagement with books where he talks about them as if they are people he knows, intimate friends and associates and family members.
Yes, this was absolutely central to Bloom from first to last. The idea that your relation with a book is utterly personal. The book finds you, and it finds you passionately. This is a destined encounter, a fated encounter. You give yourself over to the book. And one of the great things about Bloom's career as a critic is the way in which he opened himself to more and more writers as he went on. In part, this had to do with the fact that he was editing a series of anthologies for the publisher Chelsea House, in which there were anthologies of critical articles about different writers. So, you know, he reacquainted himself with a lot of books that he had not read for a while, and he discovered and rediscovered many writers. So, as you point out, there were certain writers that were mainstays. From the very beginning, Harold had his favorites, those books that he returned to over and over, those authors who kept him going, who were absolutely crucial. About the age of 7 or 8, in the library in the East Bronx, Harold found the poems of Hart Crane, and Crane was a love up to his very last year. One of the last things he wrote was a chapter on Hart Crane for a book that will come out later this year. Another early love was Melville. And then in his teenage years, he dove very deep into Faulkner. Faulkner's novels were absolutely special to him for years. Blake was another early poet. But I'm focusing on the American writers, but the American writers were very important. And as you point out, he was always interested in that visionary urge, that romantic impulse that he saw at the heart of American literature, beginning with Emerson and then flowing through Melville and Whitman and many others. But you know, there was an argument about that, and we can talk more about that. When Bloom was coming of age in graduate school in the 1950s, there was an argument about what was really the core of American literature. How should we define it? Who were the most important writers? I just want to circle back very quickly before we go on to your next question about, you mentioned Hurston and James Baldwin and Ursula Le Guin, all three of them writers that Bloom wrote very powerfully about, and his essays on them are in the American Canon. Le Guin, he became very close friends with late in life. In Baldwin, we'll get back to him in a bit, I think, elicited one of Harold's best critical essays. And Hurston, well, you can see why he did fall in love with Their Eyes Are Watching God, because that book so endorses freedom and vitalism and this wild spirit, which he valued as being at the heart of American literature.
Great. David, I want to ask you about Emerson, and that'll be immediately obvious to you, but obvious why. But Emerson, of course, the apostle of American self-reliance, is the writer Bloom calls the one inescapable American writer. And by that, he doesn't mean, right, the kind of now commonplace observation that Emerson, in some sense, is a starting point, a founding father, right? The older writer who greets Walt Whitman at the beginning of a great career, and the voice who urges other American writers to shut their ears against Europe's courtly muses to create our own national literature. Bloom means rather something deeper than that. He means that all writers who come after Emerson have to contend with him, that they have to cast their lot either with him or against him. So I hope you'll say something a little bit more about that, David. Why is, in Bloom's view, Emerson inescapable? And then relatedly, I want to ask you the question, do you think that Emerson is still inescapable at this late point in our literary history in the 21st century?
Well, John, these are fascinating questions and really unavoidable questions. For Emerson, the American self is voracious. You know, it can eat the universe like a cake. Quoting or maybe misquoting something that Emerson says in one of his journals. The idea of self-reliance, the notion that selfhood is a sort of primal power, the only thing you really have to rely on. And this is something that's very much the kernel of the American spirit, I think. But it leads in strange and sometimes dangerous directions as well. If you read an essay like Self-Reliance, you'll see that, that Emerson seems to endorse power in and of itself, this force that pulses through you. You may not know where you're going, but you can give yourself over to the power that you feel, the thrill, the sublime surge. Well, if you parse out the social or political implications of that, you may find yourself in a somewhat risky territory. And it's true that, that Emerson did. I mean, he respected power. He was not a milky idealist. He realized that the rough and ready American way of doing things was somehow brutal, but also at times, you know, impossible to ameliorate, impossible to temper. On the other hand, Emerson has a very powerful moral impulse. In the 1850s, he was more than distressed. He was thrown into tumult by Daniel Webster's endorsement of the fugitive slave law and you know, championing of the fugitive slave law. Webster was the one who enabled it to pass. And so Emerson says famously about Webster, all the drops of his blood have eyes that look downward. And of the fugitive slave law itself, he says, he calls it a filthy enactment, a filthy enactment. So he is, his righteous indignation is very powerful here. And he does have a very intense moral impulse, Emerson does. But he also has a kind of recognition of power in its rough-hewn form, a form that won't abide all of our qualifications or of our moral wishes. So that's one aspect of Emerson. In terms of the influence on later writers, yeah, I mean, Melville takes so much from him in the figures of Ishmael and of Ahab, but Melville said, "Nay, I do not oscillate in Emerson's rainbow." He had to shrug off or claim to shrug off Emerson's influence. For Dickinson, Emerson is absolutely central. And Harold actually writes very forcefully about this and very persuasively in the American Canon, that Dickinson is writing explicitly as a woman, confronting Emerson. She turns Emerson inside out, and she remains Emersonian, but she's staking her own ground in relation to him. So it's a dialogue that keeps going on throughout literary tradition in America, this conversation with Emerson.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, David. I think that, you know, you touch upon something important, which is, right, with Emerson, it's not just celebration of freedom and whim and the private self. That these things come combined with a strong moral voice and restraint. And that's something, right, that Harold was very sensitive to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. There is an appreciation of refinement in Emerson, an appreciation of style, of sophistication. And this is one of the major aspects, for example, of his book, English Traits, in which he goes to England and sees a sort of slightly fractured mirror of America in our British cousins. So yeah, there is that finesse in Emerson. He's not a wild man, nor does he endorse wildness or savagery. And yet he also knows that wildness and savagery run very deep in American life. And he's both disturbed by that and also attentive to it, as one must be.
David, I'm glad you mentioned English Traits, because I would bet that many of our viewers would be challenged to name even a single book by Emerson. I think Emerson as a canonical figure in American literature is almost unique in this way, or perhaps he is unique. He's a well-known writer. The essays are celebrated, but he's not known for any one particular book. Is there a reason for that? And where would you, for readers looking to get a foothold, where would you recommend they start with Emerson?
Well, I guess you could say the inevitable starting place really is the essay Self-Reliance. And, you know, it's an absolute blockbuster. It's an essay that you will recognize, you know, if you are an American, or if you have lived in America, if you know America, you know this essay somehow without reading it. But that's not to say that it's familiar. It's a utterly surprising essay, stimulating, provocative. The other essay I'd recommend to start with is Experience, which you can never get to the end of. I think it's Emerson's most profound essay. And you know, he takes you through so much of the Emersonian universe, so many questions, so many puzzles about our lives, our imaginations, our thoughts. Just those two essays will give you plenty to feed on. And yeah, there is so much in Emerson that we really never get to the end of it.
That's great. I want to ask you about T.S. Eliot now, not because T.S. Eliot has such a large presence in this book, really. There is an essay on Eliot, but it's a short essay. But Eliot is so important in terms of Bloom's own biography and in terms of his own intellectual development. But it's a very complicated relationship that Bloom has with Eliot. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that, David.
Well, Eliot really was an anti-romantic. You know, Mr. Eliot, as he was called, was the prevailing influence in the literary academy of the 1950s in America. And so when Eliot pronounced against the Romantic tradition, against Shelley, against Byron, against Whitman, against Emerson, this was taken very seriously. So Bloom had all of the opposite instincts. He was, from the very beginning, itching at Eliot's exclusionary habits here. The fact that Eliot leaves out the romantic and the sublime and stigmatizes those traits. So that's one source of antagonism. But of course, the greatness of Eliot is no one can deny it. I mean, I remember reading Eliot's poetry as a teenager, and it has such perfect rightness that it's very hard to explain how this came about, how Eliot, invented such a feeling of rightness in his poetry. And Harold, I think, had the same feeling about Eliot, that no, you cannot get The Wasteland out of your head. You cannot get Proof Rock out of your head. And one thing that Harold did sort of slyly was point out that, well, Whitman is actually a very important influence on Eliot, that Eliot read Whitman very carefully. There's a lot of Whitman in Eliot. Breeding lilacs out of the dead land from The Wasteland. That comes directly from Whitman's Lilacs elegy, Bloom argued. So yeah, there's a complicated relationship here. But meanwhile, Eliot was really standing in the path of everything that Harold wanted to do.
I remember the translator Robert Fitzgerald saying that he had been ruined as a poet because of T.S. Eliot. He couldn't get that iambic pentameter out of his head. Mm-hmm. My sense is that in his later years, Harold had relented a little bit. That he came to appreciate, or acknowledge rather, the power of the poetry, but he never really ever warmed to the prose. And I think my sense is he could never really forgive Eliot for not liking Emerson enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely part of it. Eliot's remarks about Jews certainly played a major role as well in Bloom's dislike. So I do feel that, but the important point here is that Bloom really won this battle, not only in the Yale English department, which when I was a grad student there in the 80s, was completely taken over by the Bloom canon, with Whitman, Melville, Elizabeth Bishop, Wallace Stevens, these were the major American writers. But it was true at a lot of other institutions too. I mean, here Harold's main competitor, I think, was the school of Hugh Kenner, who was a sort of interesting frenemy of Bloom. And Kenner insisted that Pound, rather than Stevens, was the central figure in 20th century American poetry.
One of the essays in this book that I really absolutely love is the essay on Hemingway, which is full of insights and surprising connections. Hemingway, of course, the great short story writer and novelist, began his professional writing career as a journalist. In the early 20s, he's writing for the Toronto Star, I think first as a freelancer, then as a foreign correspondent, and ultimately as a staff writer for the Star. And then he quits the Star, I think, in late 23 or early 24. And then come those remarkable early books. I'm talking about the commercial publications in our time in 1925, and The Sun Also Rises in 1926. And he breaks onto the scene with such a force that it's just absolutely incredible. There seems almost to be not even an apprentice period. And And the usual explanation goes something like this, right? That the famous prose style and the method of description, where everything is, all of the emotions are submerged, they're below the surface, that he learned these things as a journalist in his years working for the Star. And I understand that comment or that observation, but it never seemed to me exactly right. There are so many qualities to the poetry that seem lyrical. And Hemingway himself pointed to his precursor, if you will, as Twain. But Harold finds a rather different and a much more important influence on Hemingway. And I wonder if you would say a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a very startling notion, and I think a correct one that Bloom introduces about Hemingway's style. He quotes, for example, a line from Whitman. I mean, the figure that you're alluding to is Whitman, and he says Whitman had a great influence on Hemingway. For example, think of this line from Leaves of Grass. This grass is very dark to come from the white heads of old mothers. And yeah, that's a Hemingway line, you know, in advance. You can hear it. You can hear the characteristic Hemingway cadence. Yeah, Hemingway really, well, you know, Wallace Stevens said that that Hemingway was a great American poet. I'm not sure whether this was before or after their fist fight. You know, Stevens punched Hemingway in Key West and injured his hand. I mean, Hemingway's prose is remarkably lyrical, and there's nothing like the way Hemingway, I mean, his magical feats of beginning and ending a story in just the way he does, frequently feats of leaving things out. So I just wanted to wrap up that our little conversation about Hemingway with Harold's remark about the snows of Kilimanjaro, which is perhaps Hemingway's greatest story. It's certainly his most autobiographical story about the dying novelist. And Harold says, if you love too much and demand too much, you will wear it all out. And so this is another thing I love so much about Bloom's criticism, that he's able to give you these moments of aphoristic insight. And there are many, many of those moments in his work. If you love too much and demand too much, you will wear it all out. So that sense of Hemingway's awareness of himself as a very demanding figure. Someone once said that relaxing with him was you know, too exhausting for most people. That is, the effort of relaxing for Hemingway was a great effort indeed. You know, it was an entire project involving much equipment and much drinking and much physical activity. So, you know, that sense of stress and that sense of life as a demanding task, one that wears other people out and yourself as well, I think is a genuine insight into Hemingway.
Yeah, Harold prefers the stories to the novels, though he admits the power of The Sun Also Rises. I think he actually calls maybe it's in the essay on Hemingway, maybe elsewhere in the book, but he says that Hemingway is perhaps the most important writer in the English language in terms of the short story since James Joyce. Is that plausible?
I think that's fair. I can't really think of another. I mean, we can put Hemingway in the ring, to use his own image, with various other contenders, but I suspect that he would win as a short story writer.
Fair enough. Let's move on to James Baldwin. And Harold's essay on Baldwin is absolutely terrific. He's so good on Baldwin's prophetic language. Toni Morrison once said to me that if you ever met James Baldwin in person, you would see that there was a kind of aesthetic sensibility that permeated everything about the man. We were talking about the recent Raoul Peck documentary that had come out. And here I think that Bloom and Morrison might find common agreement. That is that there's a real aesthetic power to the essays. I mean, right, any reader coming to Baldwin's essays recognizes the great intelligence of the man. It's evident on every page. But Bloom is very sensitive to the aesthetic power of Baldwin's essays. He thinks that Baldwin is our great 20th century essayist. But I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about that, David.
Sure. One of the great things about Bloom's essay on Baldwin is the way he connects Baldwin to biblical prophecy, which is a tradition that Baldwin knew intimately, of course, since his father was a preacher and a ferocious one. So Baldwin really had this in his blood. And in particular, the prophet that Harold connects Baldwin to is Jeremiah, who feels God's word as a fire in his bones, painful, excruciating, unbearable. And there is that aspect of Baldwin, that sense of his prophecy for America, his message to and about America as a painful burden, one that he cannot get rid of. And what goes along with that is Baldwin's great ambivalence, the richness of his ambivalent insight about race, about Black and white in America, about men and women. So the multifaceted character of Baldwin, the way in which he's able to turn on himself as well and reevaluate himself in his essays is truly remarkable and truly fascinating. And he was, as you say, or as Toni Morrison said, an aesthete, a sophisticate. He loved, above all else, a friend of mine just told me that, I don't know about above all else, but Baldwin was a great fan of The Portrait of a Lady and The Ambassadors by James, and taught both of those books. So yeah, that's a genuine part of him as well, this interest in refinement and beauty.
Great. I want to talk about a little bit about Faulkner as well, because above all other 20th century novels, Harold prized As I Lay Dying by Faulkner, and Nathanael West's short novel, Miss Lonely Hearts. As I Lay Dying, of course, tells the story of the death of Addie Bundren and the subsequent efforts of her family to bring the body to her hometown for proper burial. And the wicked title comes from Homer's Odyssey, right? Where Odysseus encounters Agamemnon, and Agamemnon says to Odysseus, as I lay dying, the woman with the dog eyes refused to shut my eyes as I descended into Hades. And if I remember correctly, David, Harold is a fairly young man when he comes to William Faulkner. Perhaps he's not even out of his adolescence. But I want to ask you, I mean, how does this boy from, a Jewish boy from the East Bronx, become so fascinated with a Southern Gothic novelist?
That's a great question, John. And I think it makes sense to me. This is the way I explain it to myself, that Harold's enthusiasm, his directly preceding enthusiasm, had been the poems of William Blake. So he falls in love with Faulkner in high school and reads the novels over and over. Now, Faulkner's characters really seem to me to have something similar to them, to Blake's allegorical personae. They're frequently described with the same, usually ferocious adjectives. They seem like forces of nature or forces of spirit. So there is a sense in which Faulkner is really testing the boundaries of realistic fiction in his picture of human character. So I think that's one comparison. The relentlessness of Faulkner and the sort of strident lyricism and the bluster of Faulkner, all of these, it makes sense to think about as being sympathetic to someone who was in love with William Blake's poetry. Mm-hmm. So that's one comparison that I think of.
What are the, of course, we've talked a little bit about As I Lay Dying, but what are the other Faulkner novels that Harold really loved?
He liked very much Light in August, a great novel by Faulkner, and also Sanctuary, which is a book I can never fully reconcile myself to. But I think his favorite, As I Lay Dying, he was very proud, by the way, that he shared this preference with Flannery O'Connor. That is, O'Connor as well loved both As I Lay Dying and Miss Lonely Hearts by Nathanael West. So he discovered this at some point. Absalom, The Sound and the Fury. But his favorite absolutely was As I Lay Dying.
The other novel, the other favorite novel, 20th century novel, American novel, is Miss Lonely Hearts, a book that I also very much love. But Harold seems to have some curious opinions about the other West novels. He doesn't really like so much the other novel that most readers would say is probably one of West's best, Wright, the Hollywood novel.
Day of the Locust.
Day of the Locust, thank you. He much prefers A Cool Million, which is kind of a rags to riches story turned on its head. Is that a novel that, I mean, do you understand why Harold loves that novel so much? Is it one that also appeals to you?
A Cool Million. I remember I thought it was fun. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't want to hurt your feelings as a West fanatic, but my favorite West is Day of the Locust, I guess I'd have to say. Miss Lonely Hearts, in its barbaric cruelty or barbaric cynicism, is sometimes too much for me to handle, though it's extremely brilliant, extremely powerful work. But the darkness is very hard to bear, the darkness of that book. But yes, Harold truly loved Miss Lonely Hearts. Harold himself was a very good-humored, very cheerful, very sympathetic and generous friend, very sociable person, always calling up, always asking about one's children and so on. And so, it's sometimes surprising to think about his liking for such dark material.
Absolutely. Another 20th century writer who Bloom greatly valued is Flannery O'Connor. And he prized especially the short fiction, though he did also like the novel, The Violent Bear It Away. O'Connor, of course, a Catholic novelist, a self-described Catholic novelist, one who was at work in the 1950s and 60s in the Deep South, in the Protestant South. Is Harold right when he says that O'Connor's palpable designs on her readers almost robs us of the enjoyment of the stories? And by palpable designs, I think Harold means the theological machinery at work in the stories, but he also means O'Connor's embrace or seeming embrace of graphic violence as a necessary means of shocking or frightening her secular readers into spiritual awareness? Do we need to know anything about O'Connor to enjoy those stories?
Well, before I get to that question, you're absolutely right, John, that O'Connor uses violence as the means to grace. And this is deeply shocking. So that, if Nathanael West, at least in Miss Lonely Hearts, is a true misanthrope, O'Connor is she a misanthrope? Well, yes and no. She also sees a route to grace that goes through these sort of savage, freakish, dark depictions of humans that she gives us so often in her fiction. Are her designs on the reader too palpable? I think at times they are, but in her best fiction, and there's an awful lot of great fiction by O'Connor, she really keeps us wondering about the meaning of the stories rather than striking us over the head with their meaning. So she's not feeding us a theological line in the stories themselves. A story like A Good Man is Hard to Find is, I think, permanently enigmatic. This is a story, by the way, that she frequently read in public and commented on quite a bit, but it still remains mysterious and quite powerful.
And Harold says in his essay on O'Connor that remains the best starting place for someone who wants to read O'Connor. You think that's true?
I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a knockout of a story, and grimly funny, wildly funny. So maybe Harold was thinking of the fact that when Flannery O'Connor talked about her own work, she seemed to iron out some of the grim humor of it and the outrageousness of it. But you can see that humor in full flower in A Good Man is Hard to Find. Mm-hmm. That's for
sure. Harold preferred The Violent Bear It Away to the other novel, right? There were only two of them. The other novel being Wise Blood. Is he right? Is he right in that preference? Do you have a favorite?
I reread Violent Bear It Away and also taught it recently. And yeah, I love it. I was once again knocked out by it. I love the figure of the 14-year-old prophet, young Tarwater, who's a very stubborn and irascible young man indeed, and triumphs. Well, I don't know, triumph is not the right word, but he makes it through various ordeals. And at the end of the book, he's striding off towards the dark city where the children of God lay sleeping. So, there's something to me very attractive about this figure, more so than Hazel Motes and Wise Blood, I suppose. But yeah, I do love that book, The Violent Bear It Away.
I just love the pure zaniness of Wise Blood. Right, the story of Hazel Motes, a nihilist, or I suppose a would-be nihilist, who takes to the streets to preach the church without Christ. Hazel Motes says, "I'm a member and a preacher to that church where the blind don't see, the lame don't walk, and what's dead stays that way." Which is
it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. And I think that Harold was thinking about O'Connor when 30 years ago he wrote his fascinating book, The American Religion. It's a book that deals with Mormons, Pentecostalists, Seventh-day Adventists, Christian Scientists, the African American Church, this whole panoply of American religiosity. And Bloom was very struck by the fact that in polls over and over, in surveys, Americans claim that God speaks to them personally, that in effect they walk with God, they have a direct connection to the divine. And it's something quite remarkable. No other nation has that feeling. But you see this coming out in O'Connor's work. God mounted south.
I think we have a little bit more time, but let me ask you one last question. I think Max is going to come in and bring us to the Q&A, but I want to ask you one more question. I mean, Harold has been dead for only a little while now. Most of the figures that he writes about in the American canon are now dead, but not all of them. But I want to ask you this question: who among living poets, living American poets, did Bloom most value?
His nominee, and I agree completely, his nominee for the greatest living American poet is the African-American poet J. Wright, who's a remarkable author, someone who has blended with great insight and great finesse various traditions, including West African, Mexican tradition, and he's a very syncretic writer. He's a true visionary, comparable in some ways to Rudin or Rilke. So Harold had a great appreciation of J. Wright, and was, one great thing about Harold, by the way, is that this is a related question, is he was a real champion and an advocate of writers. He was a great writer of fan letters to authors whose books he liked. And in fact, this was the beginning of his great friendship with John Ashbery. That is, he read Ashbery's first book, Some Trees, and wrote him a fan letter, a very enthusiastic one. And that happened more than once. I saw it happen actually quite recently. The poet Rowan Ricardo Phillips, whose book I gave Harold. Harold loved it, and he immediately wrote to Rowan, telling him how much he liked it. So there's a very quite warm and personal aspect of his relation to these authors.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're about to go to the Q&A soon. Is that true, Max?
That's true. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Great, and you've sparked some interesting questions from our viewers. So let's just jump into them. Michael Ryan, who writes from Philadelphia, Michael's actually a Library of America fellow, asks, if Emerson is the beginning, what about Hawthorne? And I think partly what he may be thinking there is Hawthorne is also, of course, obsessed with American origins in a different way, related way. Did Bloom read Hawthorne? And what was his understanding or relationship to the Puritan legacy? After all, he was nestled at Yale for so many years.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful question. Thanks for that. Michael Ryan, whose work I know, of course, and admire. The relation with Hawthorne is an interesting one. Harold loved, he said his favorite heroine in American fiction was Hester Prynne. And next to Hester Prynne was Isabel Archer from James's Portrait of a Lady. So, and he's right. I mean, Harold really fixed on something so advanced, so sophisticated, so discerning. So this is the word he used, proto-feminist, about Hester Prynne. He really relished that that character. His favorite short story was Hawthorne's Wakefield, about the man who stays away as a kind of experiment from his house for 20 years. He observes his wife through the window and sees how she will react to his prolonged absence. And then at the end of the story, he sets his foot in the doorway and the story ends. Spoiler alert, sorry. But so this very haunting and very enigmatic story Harold liked quite a bit. Of course, Emerson and Hawthorne didn't get along at all. They went on a walk together of several miles. And after that, Hawthorne avoided Emerson assiduously.
And this is a related question or not, but Beth Elstein, I'm not sure where she's writing from, she asks about, she says, what was Bloom's relationship with the Hebrew Bible? And I think I would maybe point that question a little bit and ask you to talk about it, maybe in relationship to American writing. I mean, we're talking about Bible drenched, writers, American writers who were, drenched in the cadences and rhythms of the Hebrew Bible. So maybe you could talk about Bloom and the Hebrew Bible, Bloom and the Hebrew Bible and American writing.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, Harold certainly read the Bible in Hebrew in Cheder when he was a very young child. And he had its cadences in his head as well. The cadences of the King James Bible, which was so utterly familiar, you know, in the bloodstream of the major American authors. And there is something unavoidably biblical about, for example, Melville, you know, Melville's rhetoric. That's, you know, every reader, I think, who compares the King James to Melville will see this. In terms of Harold's sense, well, he wrote about the Bible fairly often. By the way, he first read the New Testament when some missionaries presented a Yiddish copy, a Yiddish translation of the Gospels to him at his front door. He was probably about 6 or 7 years old. At any rate, yes. So, but he was he wrote very movingly and very pointedly about the uncanniness of the Hebrew Bible, in particularly the family dramas of the Hebrew Bible, parents and children misrecognizing one another. The ultimate parent being, of course, God, who has a quite tumultuous relation with his or her creation. So, so yeah, it was very much a live issue for him. The Talmud, on the other hand, he cared nothing about. He told me he didn't even have a Talmud, but he liked reading the Zohar, the Jewish mystical compendium.
David Andrew Scheil, who's writing from the University of Minnesota, asked if you could talk about Bloom's relationship, I guess both personal and his literary understanding, with Ursula Le Guin. He writes that he has a memory of reading an introduction to one of the modern critical views volumes on Le Guin. How did they meet and when, if you know? But also, how did he see her in terms of the American literary tradition?
Okay, great questions. I don't know when they first became acquainted. I do have an answer to that question. How did they meet and when? They did not meet. I know this for sure. They only ever exchanged emails. I think they talked on the phone a few times, but it was mostly emails. But there were lots and lots of emails. And my guess is that was probably in the 90s, but I could be wrong. Harold loved The Left Hand of Darkness, Le Guin's great novel from the late 60s. And he also liked very much The Dispossessed, which is also a distinguished novel, and other books by her as well. And he also championed her as a poet. She is, in fact, a very interesting poet. And Max, correct me if I'm wrong, her poetry is forthcoming from the Library of America, yes. So he had a real affinity to her. He did not much like her advocacy of other science fiction writers. She was really the only science fiction writer that he liked. I think this was a shortcoming on Harold's part. You know, he saw nothing in Philip Dick, for example, to admire. And I frankly disagree with him there. But what he loved in Le Guin is that sense of the solitary spirit and her sheer imaginativeness, you know, her sheer range. So, you know, the way she was able to invent these worlds and rethink, you know, who we were, human sexuality, human imagination, in a book like The Left Hand of Darkness.
Thanks, David. There's an interesting question from Sally Connolly at the University of Houston, maybe someone you know.
Yes. Hi, Sally.
She says, I'd like to hear your take on the poetic and lyrical interludes and anxiety of influence. I find them fascinating since they highlight the creative impulse that exists alongside the critical. And I guess I would broaden that into a question about Bloom as a writer. Because it's not only the creative interludes, but he also, his particular style of critical writing even. I mean, he often referred to his mode as the critical sublime. And maybe you could just talk about that. And also he talked about the fact that he couldn't write poetry himself, and yet poetry was this great love. So maybe putting all of that together and talking about Bloom as a writer.
Yes, this is quite interesting. I think those interludes, thank you, Sally, that's a great question. And I do think that those interludes in The Anxiety of Influence are his poems. Those are Bloom's poems, possibly the only poems he ever wrote, or certainly the only ones he has ever published. So unlike Jeffrey Hartman, for example, his friend and colleague at Yale, who did write poetry eventually and publish poetry, Harold did not do this. In terms of his critical style, it really varied. And it varied chiefly because of the influence of some of the theory mavens at Yale, especially Paul de Man, I would single out in the 1970s, who was very dear friends with Harold. And Bloom's style, it's as if in the 1970s, Harold was trying to express so much, and what he was trying to express was so knotty, and Knotty, so enigmatic, so in some sense convoluted and rich, that his style became that way too. It became a very difficult style. But that was really a kind of detour, I think, in his criticism. If you look at Bloom's earlier criticism, for example, The Visionary Company, his great book about English Romanticism, I think still probably the best book about English Romantic, best single book about the English Romantic poets. It's very clear, very vibrant, and very stylish criticism. And so he returned to that mode after what I think of as a sort of theoretical aberration. That may be too strong a word, aberration.
We're coming toward the end here, but let's try to, you know how at the end of a fireworks display, they have a whole bunch of things go off at once. So I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to put a couple questions together and ask you just to comment on a number of them. Benito Cacinero from Philadelphia asks if you can comment on Bloom's fascination with Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And I would say on McCarthy's work in general, but also we have questions about Pynchon. Why was he fascinated by Pynchon? You know, where did he stand on writers like Mailer and Vidal? So there's a lot of questions about specific writers. So maybe you could just briefly touch on, you know, what was it about McCarthy that he found fascinating? What was it that he admired about Pynchon? And I guess the question is, why didn't he respond so much to Mailer and Vidal and other writers of the 60s that loomed large at the time?
Mm-hmm. I remember having a discussion, to start with McCarthy. I remember having asking Harold very pointedly about The Road. Harold always loved Blood Meridian and insisted that, you know, this was an absolute masterpiece and McCarthy's central book. And so I said, well, I like it too. It's rather overwhelming, and you know, it's certainly a sublime book. How about The Road? And so I got him to admit that he also liked The Road, but he wasn't really ready to do that. He was such a fan of Blood Meridian. You know, Pynchon, he was disappointed in Pynchon's work as Pynchon went on. I mean, the books that he loved were Mason and Dixon, Gravity's Rainbow, and The Crying of Lot 49, and really, I think, not any of the others. Mailer and Vidal, he knew Vidal and was charmed by him. In fact, I remember being at Harold's house when news came of Vidal's death, and you know, and he was quite funny and quite rueful about Vidal. So he, but in terms of Vidal's works, he liked a few of the novels. He liked the historical novels. Mailer, he reviewed several times, and he liked this book by Mailer, Ancient Evenings, which he described as being full of humbuggery and bumbuggery. But he had a certain appreciation for what he saw as Mailer's showmanship and, you know, shamanism. So yeah, there were, those writers are not in the American canon because I don't think Bloom really, he was less substantial in it. I mean, Cormac McCarthy is, you know, certainly, but not Mailer or Vidal, and Pynchon is in there, but I'm referring just to Mailer and Vidal. We've left out because his comments on them were, you know, seemed less meaty than on some of the other writers.
Thank you. I think we have to end it there. There's a lot of great questions that we didn't get to. It's not, you know, Bloom and Freud, Bloom and Shakespeare, but that's for another evening. You've been listening to David Mikics and John Kulka discuss Harold Bloom and the new book, The American Canon, Literary Genius from Emerson to Pynchon, edited by David and published by the Library of America. I hope you will join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America next Thursday, June 25th, Reading James Baldwin Now, a masterclass on Baldwin's great, profound story, Sonny's Blues, about a jazz pianist's struggles with his art and his addiction, led by Farrah Griffin, Chair of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. The story can be found in Library of America Series Volume Number 97, Baldwin's Early Novels and Stories, edited by Toni Morrison, and in other editions. Details about this and other Library of America upcoming virtual events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find more information about the American Canon and links to purchase that and other volumes of great American writing. Thanks again to David Mikics and John Kulka for a lively and provocative conversation, and have a great evening.